The black SUV pulled up to the curb outside the towering glass building, and the driver quickly stepped out to open the rear door. Inside, the company's billionaire CEO, Richard Coleman, adjusted his tie with the same sharpness he used to adjust his deals. Richard was a man who commanded silence the moment he entered a room. His reputation was larger than life, and no one dared interrupt him when he spoke. Yet, as he climbed into the car that afternoon, something happened that no amount of money or authority could have prepared him for. Sliding onto the plush leather seat, Richard sighed heavily, already pulling out his phone to dictate a few sharp emails. He hadn't noticed at first that someone else was sitting quietly in the far corner of the back seat, a little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old. She had dark skin, big brown eyes, and was clutching a worn-out teddy bear that looked like it survived years of love and tears. Richard's eyes flicked toward a reflection in the tinted window, confused. "Driver, what is this? Why is there a child in my car?" His tone was impatient, bordering on angry. Before the driver could answer, the girl suddenly leaned forward, looked Richard dead in the eyes, and said in a surprisingly firm voice, "Shut up." For a second, the world seemed to freeze. Richard blinked, certain he had misheard. No one, absolutely no one, spoke to him like that. The driver's hands tightened nervously on the steering wheel, waiting for the explosion. Richard's chest swelled with disbelief. "What did you just say to me?" The little girl didn't flinch. Her small hands gripped the teddy bear tighter, but her voice didn't waver. "I said, shut up, please. You're too loud." Richard was stunned into silence. His mouth opened to demand answers, but something about the way her eyes glistened stopped him. They weren't defiant eyes. No, they were desperate. There was a tremble in her lip, and suddenly Richard realized she wasn't being disrespectful. She was begging. And for the first time in years, the man who controlled boardrooms and commanded nations of workers actually shut his mouth. The car rolled forward through busy city streets, but the atmosphere inside felt strangely heavy. Richard leaned back against the seat, studying the girl who had just silenced him. No one in his billion-dollar empire dared to speak to him like that. And yet here sat a child, small enough to disappear in the folds of the seat, commanding him with nothing more than trembling words. He finally cleared his throat. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than usual. The girl hesitated, pulling the teddy bear closer. "Lila," she whispered, then added quickly, "and don't be mad at me. I didn't mean to be rude. It's just—" Her words broke off, swallowed by the sound of her shaky breathing. Richard frowned, his irritation slowly fading into curiosity. "Just what?" he pressed. Lila's small shoulders rose and fell, and she stared down at the teddy bear, rubbing its ear with her thumb. "My head hurts when people yell. And you talk so loud. My mommy says I have to stay calm when it starts. Otherwise," she trailed off, as if the rest was too heavy for her little voice to carry. The driver glanced at Richard in the rearview mirror, his eyes silently urging patience. Richard, for once, didn't bark at the man. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his phone forgotten on the seat beside him. "Otherwise what, Lila?" he asked carefully. The little girl lifted her eyes. They were brimming with tears she was trying hard to hide. "Otherwise, I might get really sick. Mommy says the quiet helps me breathe better." Richard felt a strange pang in his chest, one he couldn't quite explain. The thought of this fragile child, clutching a threadbare teddy bear and begging for silence, unsettled him in a way no failed deal or hostile takeover ever had. For the next few blocks, the car was completely quiet. Richard, who always filled silence with commands and plans, found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. Every so often, he glanced at Lila, and each time, the same question pounded in his mind. Who was this child, and why was she in his car? Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down harder with each passing minute. He was not a man who tolerated mysteries. Every meeting, every decision in his empire was built on clear facts and absolute control. But this little girl, sitting so quietly in his car, had thrown all of that off balance. He finally broke the silence. "Lila, how did you get here? Who brought you into my car?" His voice was softer now, careful, as though afraid his usual sharpness might shatter her. Lila glanced toward the driver, then back at Richard. "The man outside your building. He said this car was safe. He told me to sit here until he came back." She clutched the teddy bear tighter, her knuckles white. "He said he was going to find my mommy." Richard's brows furrowed. He didn't remember giving such an order. His driver, clearly nervous, spoke up from the front. "Sir, there was a gentleman who asked if the child could wait here. He said it was urgent, and since he mentioned your name, I assumed." "You assumed wrong," Richard cut in, though his words lacked their usual bite. Instead, there was concern edging in, a rare visitor in his voice. He turned back to Lila, studying her fragile frame. "How long have you been looking for your mother?" Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. "Since yesterday. She told me to wait at the corner near the big building. She promised she'd come back fast, but she didn't." Her small voice cracked on the last word. Something twisted inside Richard's chest. He had seen broken companies, desperate men, crumbling fortunes. But the sight of this small girl trying to hold herself together pierced through his armor in a way none of those things ever had. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen, Lila, we're going to find your mom. I'll make sure of it." For the first time, her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Really? You'd help me?" Richard nodded slowly, surprising even himself. "Yes, I'll help." What he didn't know yet was that helping her would change everything he thought he knew about himself. The car turned onto a quieter street, away from the roar of the city. Richard's mind spun faster than the wheels beneath them. This wasn't just some random encounter anymore. A little girl abandoned in front of his headquarters, left in his car by a stranger? It didn't add up. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over his assistant's number. Normally, he barked orders without hesitation. But this time, he paused, glancing at Lila. Her small hands fiddled nervously with the teddy bear's frayed paw, and her fragile frame seemed to shrink with every bump in the road. Instead of calling his assistant, Richard slid the phone back into his pocket. He cleared his throat. "Lila, do you remember anything about where your mommy went? Did she say who she was meeting?" The girl shook her head, curls bouncing softly around her face. "No. She just said she had to talk to someone important and that I should be brave." The word brave hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fear. The driver finally spoke up again. "Sir, should I take you to the police station? They'll know what to do." Richard almost said yes, but when his eyes fell back on Lila, something inside him rebelled. He had dealt with police stations before, cold, loud, and filled with chaos. That wasn't the place for a frightened child who begged for quiet. "No," Richard said firmly. "Not yet." Lila tilted her head. "Curious. Then where are we going?" For a moment, Richard didn't know. He had built empires, yet here he was, directionless in front of child. Finally, he replied, "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can rest until we figure this out." The girl nodded slowly, trusting him in a way that startled him. Trust was something Richard had bought with money all his life. Yet here it was, freely given by a child who had nothing. As the car pulled into the gated driveway of his private estate, Richard felt the weight of what he was doing. Bringing Lila into his world wasn't part of any plan. And yet, deep down, he knew this wasn't an accident. Something about this child was meant to collide with his life. The iron gate slid open, and the SUV rolled into Richard's sprawling estate. The mansion loomed at the end of the driveway, all polished stone and glass, a palace for a man who lived above the world. Normally, Richard felt pride when he came home, pride in what he had built, in the fortune he had carved out of nothing. But tonight, pulling in with a little girl by his side, the house felt different, colder, emptier. The car stopped, and Richard opened his door, motioning for Lila to follow. She hesitated, clutching her teddy bear tightly, eyes widening at the sight of the massive home. "This is where you live?" she whispered. Richard nodded. "Yes, you'll be safe here." She stepped out cautiously, her shoes crunching against the gravel. Her eyes darted around the marble pillars, the rows of glowing windows, the perfectly trimmed hedges. To her, It looked like something out of a storybook, but she didn't smile. Instead, she asked, "Is it always this quiet?" The question startled Richard. He had paid millions for silence, for privacy away from the world. And yet, hearing it through her small, trembling voice, it suddenly felt more like loneliness than peace. Inside, the staff rushed forward, but Richard held up a hand, dismissing them. "Prepare a guest room," he instructed one of the housekeepers. His tone was still commanding, but there was something gentler beneath it. The woman looked surprised, but nodded. Lila walked beside him down the long marble hallways, her little footsteps echoing. She glanced at the tall ceilings, the golden chandeliers, the endless walls of art. "It's too big," she muttered softly. "No one could ever fill all the space." Her words hit Richard harder than he expected. He had built his life around filling space, with wealth, with power, with possessions. But he suddenly realized that none of it filled the silence that lingered in these halls. As they reached the guest room, Lila looked up at him. "Will you really help me find my mommy?" Richard met her gaze, steady and sure. "Yes, Lila, I promise." But deep inside, a troubling thought whispered. Promises were easy to make. Keeping them was another story. The guest room was prepared with fresh linens and soft lighting, but Lila didn't seem to care about the luxury. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her teddy bear, her small legs dangling. Richard lingered by the doorway, unsure of what to do. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, stared down ruthless rivals, and yet, standing in front of a little girl, he felt strangely powerless. "Are you hungry?" he asked finally. She shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "A little." Within minutes, the kitchen staff brought up a tray, warm soup, bread, and a glass of milk. Lila's eyes softened when she saw it. She picked up the spoon, but paused. "Do I eat here? Or do I wait?" Richard frowned. "Wait for what?" Her voice grew quiet. "For Mommy. She doesn't like when I eat without her." Something sharp tugged at Richard's chest. He knelt beside the bed, lowering himself to her level. "Lila, your mommy will want you to eat. You need your strength, right?" She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if he could be trusted. Then, slowly, she began to eat, tiny spoonfuls at a time. Watching her, Richard realized how fragile she was. Every movement spoke of a child who had learned to be careful, to stay small, to not take up too much space. When she finished, she whispered, "Thank you." Richard gave a small nod, but inside, something stirred. Gratitude was rare in his world. People took from him because of what he had, not who he was. But this child, she looked at him differently. Later, as Lila curled under blankets, Richard turned to leave. Just as he reached the door, her voice stopped him. "Mr. Richard?" He looked back. Her big brown eyes peeked out from under the covers. "Will you stay?" "Just until I fall asleep. It's too quiet." The request pierced him deeper than any deal ever could. Slowly, he crossed back and sat in the chair beside her bed. She closed her eyes, gripping her teddy bear tight. Within minutes, her breathing softened into sleep. Richard sat there in the stillness, realizing something he had never admitted before. For all his wealth, he had never known what it felt like to be needed. The night stretched long inside Richard's mansion. He sat silently in the chair, watching Lila's chest rise and fall with each fragile breath. The house, usually filled with emptiness, now seemed alive with the simple sound of a child sleeping. For once, Richard didn't want to move, didn't want to retreat to his private study or drown himself in business reports. He just stayed. But rest didn't come easily. His mind was a storm. Who had left Lila in his car? Why hadn't her mother returned? And why, of all people, had fate placed this child in his path? As dawn crept through the curtains, Richard finally slipped out of the room. In the hallway, his driver was waiting nervously. "Sir, should I call the authorities now? This situation, it's unusual." Richard rubbed his temples. He should have said yes. That would have been the logical, responsible choice. Yet, when he pictured Lila's pleading eyes, the idea of handing her over to strangers felt wrong. "Not yet," he said firmly. "We'll try another way first." By mid-morning, Richard sat at his desk, pulling strings away only a man of his power could. He called contacts in city offices, private investigators, even hospital administrators. Her name is Lila, he told them. 7 years old. Dark skin, brown eyes. She's been missing her mother since yesterday. Find me every lead. Hours passed with little progress. Each dead and gnawed at him, tightening the knot in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling helpless, and he hated it. But whenever he thought of giving up, he remembered Lila whispering, "Please, you're too loud." That desperate voice kept him going. Late in the afternoon, one of his investigators finally called back. "Mr. Coleman, we might have something." A woman matching her description was seen near a clinic on the west side of the city. She looked distressed, sick, possibly, but then she disappeared. Richard's grip tightened around the phone. Sick. That single word echoed in his mind, connecting dots he hadn't noticed before. Lila's sensitivity to noise, her plea for calm, her mother's urgency. It wasn't just abandonment. Something deeper, darker was happening, and Richard knew he was running out of time. Richard wasted no time. He grabbed his coat, signaled the driver, and within minutes they were racing across the city. Lila, still sleepy-eyed, sat beside him in the back seat, clutching her teddy bear as the car swerved through traffic. She didn't ask where they were going. She simply trusted him. That trust weighed on him like nothing he had ever carried before. The clinic on the west side was small and overcrowded, a far cry from the pristine hospitals Richard was used to funding. As he entered with Lila at his side, nurses and patients turned to stare. A billionaire CEO didn't belong in a place like this, but he didn't care. He strode to the front desk. A woman, dark skin, thin, early 30s. She would have come in yesterday. Where is she? The nurse hesitated, flipping through a chart. Her eyes softened when she looked at Lila. She was here. Severe exhaustion. Complications from an untreated illness. She left before we could admit her. Said she had to find her daughter. Lila's little hand tightened around Richard's. "That's Mommy," she whispered. The nurse added gently, "We tried to stop her, but she was desperate." Richard's chest tightened. This wasn't neglect. It was survival. Her mother had been fighting to care for her, while silently fighting her own sickness. And now she was missing. Hours later, after following every lead, they found her. A small church on the outskirts of the city. Its doors cracked open. Inside, on one of the benches, sat a woman with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, clutching her sides as though every breath hurt. When she looked up and saw Lila, her face crumbled into tears. "Mommy," Lila cried, rushing forward. She buried herself in her mother's arms, both of them shaking with relief. Richard stood a few feet away, watching silently. For once, he didn't feel like the most powerful man in the room. He felt like a witness to something sacred. The woman looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Thank you for keeping her safe." Richard swallowed hard, emotions he had long buried rising to the surface. "She saved me, too," he admitted softly. That night, as he drove them both back to safety, Richard realized something profound. His wealth had built him an empire, but a frightened little girl had taught him humanity, and that was worth more than all the money in the world.